In 793 AD, Viking warriors captured priestesses from monasteries, but what they did next was far worse than the infamous Blood Eagle. These women weren't just killed, they were broken, stripped of their sacred identity, and forced to betray their own faith. The Vikings believed priestesses held dangerous spiritual power, and their methods of control were calculated, ritualized, and designed to destroy mind and soul. Some survived only to become tools of their captors, while others planned revenge that changed Viking history. This is the hidden story of brutality, control, and resistance the history books won't tell you. The priestesses came from a lineage that people believed carried divine authority. They were trained from childhood to guard rituals, protect sacred knowledge, and guide their communities in matters of faith. Their presence was considered a blessing, and harming them was seen as an offense that could bring disaster. That is why their capture felt impossible to imagine. No army expected anyone to take such women alive, because their role made them too important, too protected, and too feared. But the Vikings understood something others didn't. They knew these women were more than spiritual leaders, they were symbols of identity. By targeting them, the Vikings aimed to break the spirit of the people they conquered, not just win battles. They wanted to control the faith behind the community. Their real suffering began long before any blade was drawn. And the Vikings carried a method for dealing with priestesses that many believed was far worse than the Blood Eagle itself. The raid came without warning. The guards at the temple expected a routine watch, not a fast and coordinated attack. The Vikings broke through the outer defenses before anyone understood what was happening. The guards tried to hold their positions, but they were overwhelmed in moments, not because they were weak, but because the attackers already knew exactly where to strike. Instead of destroying the temple, the Vikings moved straight toward the inner chambers where the priestesses lived. They avoided killing them, even when it slowed the raid. The priestesses were dragged out alive, one by one, because the Vikings believed their capture carried more power than their death. Alive, they were more valuable, but also more doomed. The warriors already had a plan for prisoners who carried religious influence, a plan far more deliberate than ordinary captivity. The Vikings believed that holy women carried more than knowledge. They were thought to hold unseen power, the kind that could curse enemies or protect entire communities. A priestess was not viewed as a simple captive, she was seen as someone who could influence spirits and shift fate itself. Because of these beliefs, a captured priestess became a threat even without weapons. The Vikings feared that her prayers, her rituals, or even her silence could bring harm to them or weaken their victories. So in their minds, she had to be broken before she became harmless. They thought a priestess had to lose everything that gave her spiritual strength. To control her body, they believed they had to first destroy her identity. And the first step toward this destruction began with a ritual the Vikings used specifically for sacred captives. The first thing the Vikings focused on was removing everything that marked the priestesses as sacred. They took away the items that represented their roles, the beads, the bands, the carved symbols, and the garments that identified them as spiritual leaders. But the deeper harm came from forcing them to reject the duties they had carried all their lives. The priestesses were ordered to speak against their own vows, deny their guidance, and verbally separate themselves from the roles they once protected. This was not meant to injure their bodies but to weaken their sense of worth. The humiliation was deliberate, designed to show them that nothing they once represented held power anymore. To the Vikings, this was only the beginning. They believed that stripping identity wasn't enough, a priestess needed to be purified before she could be fully controlled, and they were already preparing the next step in that process. The Vikings believed that anyone with spiritual influence carried an inner force that had to be emptied before they could be controlled. In their view, a priestess was filled with loyalty to her gods, her people, and her sacred duties. To the Vikings, this loyalty made her resistant, so they created a process they called purification. It was not meant to kill her, and that is what made it more disturbing. Its purpose was to reshape her, to remove the identity she had lived with since childhood. Historians later describe this treatment as worse than the Blood Eagle because the Blood Eagle ended life quickly, while this method targeted the mind and spirit. They didn't want her dead, they wanted her changed. And the next step in that change involved forcing the priestesses to take part in acts that directly opposed their own rituals, something the Vikings believed would weaken their connection to everything they once protected. The Vikings understood that a priestess's strength came from the vows she lived by. So they targeted those vows one by one. The women were pressured to speak against the teachings they once defended, to deny the traditions they had promised to protect, and to take part in actions that went against every rule of their order. None of this was done in silence. The Vikings demanded that each rejection be spoken aloud, forcing the priestesses to hear themselves break the duties that shaped their entire identity. These moments were symbolic betrayals, designed to make them feel as if they had cut the final ties to their past. Each broken vow took something they could never reclaim. And once the Vikings believed the priestesses had been emptied of loyalty, they moved to the next phase, shaping them into tools that would serve the clan's own beliefs and authority. Once the priestesses had been stripped of their vows and sacred symbols, the Vikings assigned them new roles designed to erase their former power. They were made to serve the household in ways that forced obedience and dependency. Every task, every command, reinforced the idea that their previous life no longer mattered. The Vikings controlled what they ate, where they slept, and how they interacted with others. Their spiritual knowledge was not respected but exploited, often used to support rituals that went against everything they once believed. Through constant pressure and control, the priestess's identity was reshaped to serve the clan. A priestess was no longer a priestess, she became something else. But even this transformation was not enough. The chieftain demanded one final step to ensure that their old loyalties could never return. The chieftain believed that to fully control a priestess, she had to be symbolically reborn. In Viking thinking, this rebirth removed her ties to her old gods and prepared her to serve their own beliefs. The process involved renouncing her previous faith publicly, taking new oaths to Norse gods, and participating in rituals that replaced her former sacred practices. She was given a new name, a new identity, and forced to acknowledge that her old life no longer existed. Every action was calculated to sever the connection to her past, leaving her dependent on the clan for guidance and authority. Rebirth, for them, meant destruction of everything she had been. And once this step was complete, the process moved into the darkest phase, where obedience was tested in ways that challenged not just her identity, but her will to resist entirely. The final initiation was designed to ensure the priestesses would obey completely for the rest of their lives. They were forced to participate in ceremonies that tested their loyalty to the Vikings and stripped away any remaining sense of independence. The rituals were structured to create fear, confusion, and helplessness, emphasizing the complete power of the captors. Every command, every test, reminded the priestesses that resistance could cost them or others dearly. Even the most hardened Viking warriors refused to watch this part, knowing the cruelty was extreme. The goal was not physical harm alone but total psychological control, so that any thought of returning to their old beliefs would seem impossible. Those who resisted faced the harshest consequences, facing isolation, punishment, or additional rituals meant to crush any remaining will, setting the stage for the next step in their forced submission. Priestesses who refused to comply with the Vikings' retraining faced relentless measures. They were separated from others, confined to small spaces, and cut off from any contact that might give them strength. The Vikings used constant verbal humiliation, forcing them to listen to their own beliefs being mocked and their vows dismissed. Even simple daily tasks became punishments, designed to break their pride and self-worth. The goal was complete submission, not death, so the suffering was prolonged and methodical. Refusing didn't save them, it only dragged their suffering further. Those who survived this stage were left permanently changed, setting the stage for the next phase, living under Viking control while carrying the weight of everything they had lost. The priestesses who survived the rituals were absorbed into the Viking community under strict control. They were given duties that served the clan, often using the knowledge and skills they once applied to their sacred roles, but now for purposes they could not endorse. Every action reinforced their dependence and reminded them of the identity they had lost. Their previous authority, beliefs, and personal freedom were gone, replaced by a constant expectation of obedience. Survival came with a price that outlived them. Yet history rarely notes this. Records focus on visible brutality and physical punishment, while the deeper, lasting impact on mind, spirit, and identity remained hidden, far worse than any single act of violence could show. The Blood Eagle was terrifying because it ended life in a violent, visible way. Death came quickly, and the victim's suffering, though extreme, was brief. The treatment of captured priestesses, however, targeted everything beyond the body. It destroyed their beliefs, stripped away their identity, forced them to betray everything they once held sacred, and left them bound to a system they could not escape. The punishment continued for months or years, shaping them into obedient tools while erasing their past entirely. Historians consider this far more horrifying because it attacked the mind and spirit, not just the flesh. The Blood Eagle ended life, this ended everything that made life meaningful. It is a form of cruelty that leaves no visible scars yet destroys the self completely, a reminder that some punishments are invisible but no less devastating.